So I'm going to build on what I spoke about this morning, which was this notion of mentalizing, mentalization, to talk about one particular use instance of mentalizing, which we call AMBIT. It stands for Adaptive Mentalization-Based Integrative Treatment. So we just call it AMBIT. The word AMBIT is an English word. I think it comes from Latin originally, and it means your sphere of influence, where I can expect and hope to have an influence. And in the work that I'm going to talk about, it's often very unclear, where is my sphere of influence? Where can I expect to have an influence? And where do I need to accept that actually I have very little or no influence? AMBIT is connected to the English word ambition, where one's intentions, where one's kind of wishes to go and to influence are concerned. So I have tried to cut out some of the slides to have less of a stress on the visual, but I'm afraid I can't do without them, so I'm going to use them a little bit. AMBIT is kind of arranged, we've arranged it in a very visual icon, really, which is this wheel. Partly because, by definition, AMBIT is rather a difficult to define approach. It's not really a therapy. It could be described as a quality improvement approach for services working with very chaotic, high-risk, not conventionally help-seeking populations. It could also and has been described as a kind of pre-therapy, trying to create the conditions that would allow evidence-based approaches to therapy to have the best possible chance of actually getting traction and making a difference and being helpful. But there are some teams that do, if you like, pretty much only AMBIT, and there are other teams that have other models of therapy, and AMBIT, if you like, comes around to support those teams to do more effective work. The approach started really in a very homemade, rather amateur way. It was myself and Peter Fugel, who'd been connected with the Anna Freud Center for a long time and had worked with Peter Fonagy. And we took some early ideas about how mentalizing might be one of many different evidence-based ways of working, and tried to apply some of this thinking to the two teams that we were working with at the time, and one of them I still work with the team now, a team in Cambridgeshire. My team worked with adolescents who have high levels of substance use as their kind of headline problem, but in fact substance use in an under 18-year-old is almost always a signal for complexity, for multiple difficulties that all interact and make the treatment of each other more difficult. So these are young people who often have significant history of mental health difficulties, abuse, neglect. They may be educationally judged to be failing or be excluded from schools. Often they're homeless or on the edge of homelessness. Many of them are vulnerable or are being exploited sexually or are getting engaged in crime and gangs. And the thing that it was in common with all of these young people is this kind of clustering of difficulties. At a time in their life, these are adolescents. My team works up to 18, and for some young people we follow till they're 21. At a time in their life when the rest of the world is kind of expecting them to sort things out. Social services and education are beginning to walk backwards and say, you know, you're an adult now, you're making choices. It's less our responsibility, more your responsibility. And the nature of the difficulties and this complexity was part of what Peter and I were struggling with. His team worked with a very similar population, young people on the edge of the care system, whose placement at home was falling apart because of aggression, mental health problems, parental mental health problems, substance use, and etc. And it was this sense that these many different difficulties were coming together at the same time at this critically risky part of a young person's life was very important. And the way that we would sort of characterize it is this mass of different problems was, if you like, the cumulative burden of those difficulties on the trajectory, the flight path of the young person was as much a problem as the individual severity of their ADHD, their trauma, their depression, their substance use. And very often these are the same young people who a little bit later in life have a sort of final label placed upon them, which they would be described as personality disordered. And in fact, that's a terrible simplification of the many difficult circumstances that they've been burdened with. And over the years, AMBIT went from being, if you like, a pet project to try to solve problems in these two teams to something that actually we began to train other workers. And each time we trained other workers, they would give us very helpful feedback about what worked for them and what didn't. And we began to take a more methodical approach to recording what we were learning from these other workers and teams and the young people and the families that they were working with. And that's key to what AMBIT is, in that AMBIT is what a wonderful researcher, John Weiss, has described in his writings, a deployment-focused approach to innovation. By that, I mean AMBIT learns as it goes. Each time we train a team, any feedback that comes back from that team or the clients the team is working goes into remodeling what AMBIT is. And over the last 10 years, AMBIT has grown and developed in response directly to the feedback of workers doing this work. And AMBIT has been pulled along in this task by being invited to train teams that originally we did not design AMBIT for. So originally it was for outreach teams working with adolescents, and now we find AMBIT working with social services departments who are safeguarding children or doing early help with younger children. We've worked in adult prisons, working with adult prisoners who are very, very sort of at the most kind of challenging end of prison-based behaviours. We work in inpatient psychiatric units, residential children's homes. So a wide array of services have come asking for training and have given us feedback which has been built into the model. And of course, what we maybe rather late in the day recognized that AMBIT has become something simply because of what we've been told and the way that we have managed, I think, a little bit to retell the dilemmas that the workers trying to be helpful in these conditions have told us. So what I'm going to tell you next, really the credit goes to the workers in the many teams and the young people and the families who've given them feedback. And AMBIT, if you like, has tried to resonate and describe those dilemmas. And one of the key experiences that workers give us again and again working with this population that in England there's a phrase I do not like. The phrase is hard to reach. We used to like it and now I don't like it because it seems to blame the client, the patient, as if it's your fault, you're hard to reach. Actually, these are often underserved populations, underhelped. We're offering help that is not helpful to them. But one of the things, if you work with these populations, that for workers is difficult is I come and I offer help and you tell me to go away. And even when I do help and you do let me help, the help often is not that helpful. It's ineffective. And this is a reality. This is painful for workers. AMBIT really arose to try to address that and a number of other key struggles for people that are trying genuinely to be helpful in this field. So to think about the work that we do with our clients, with our patients, is really, in AMBIT's view, only 1/4 of what is important to make this work effective and safe and sustainable. But for what it's worth, when we think about the client, we identify a kind of tug of war, a kind of imbalance. The worker is always trying to find their balance and is always just slightly out of balance. And one of the main ways that we lose balance is between these principles of wanting to scaffold relationships that already exist to work with the real world that this young person brings to me, to engage with relationships that in the young person's mind are important. And often that might be a parent or an uncle or an aunt or a teacher. And our work as practitioners needs to strengthen some of these relationships, which will be there long after I have gone or my worker has gone. So it's very important that we start to think about us as practitioners joining an existing system of help and not inventing a new system of help. They already have a system of help. And some of the parts of that system may need a little more help to be helpful. And it's, I think, a kind of an arrogance in us as therapists to imagine that I'm the first helpful person in this young person's life. This is a madness that we should avoid. And thinking and being serious about where is the help in this young person's life and working on how do I strengthen that help is a helpful way to look at that systemic therapists particularly know all about. This is not new. Some of the help in our clients' lives, from our perspective as professionals, is very unhelpful. Some of the young people I work with are in gangs where they would describe the head of their gang as very helpful. Why? Because they feel safe to stand beside a man who has a gun. Now, I can't compete with that. I wouldn't want to. But it's important that I recognize that in the mind of this young person, they're not just standing next to this gang leader because it makes them feel good, but it makes them feel safer than if they didn't. And I need to take the reality of that seriously. So there's a risk if I overemphasize the wish to scaffold existing helping relationships. Because some of these helping relationships, like the photograph I'm showing now is a picture of Julius Caesar and his friends. Some of his friends were not very friendly. They ended up killing him. And we can go too far as a practitioner in scaffolding the existing relationships. And in those times, we want to pull back to, if you like, the other side of the tightrope, which is to manage risk and not to be kind of fluffy and blurred about that, that when things are dangerous, things need to be made safe. On the other hand, if all I do is follow the rules to make things absolutely safe, I create conditions where this young person may not stay with me for very long. Because all I'm doing is saying, no, you can't have that, you can't have that, no, you can't do that, no, you can't do that. They go, and then I have no one to work with. Or I end up escalating the intervention to the point at which I'm removing a young person from their family home, placing them in a setting where actually there may be even more risk of meeting other young people who have very disturbed, traumatized backgrounds. And we know that the outcomes for young people in care or in prison are very poor, by and large. So as a worker, it is appropriate that I constantly have a sense that I'm either too far in one direction or I'm too far in the other direction. And AMBIT would say, it's right that you feel worried about that balance. Sometimes I'm too far into the risk management and my patients want to run away. Sometimes I lose my bearings and I'm too tolerating of the risk in the thing. Somewhere in the middle is about right. What is right is that I'm unable to make that decision on my own. And that's why, if you like, our icon in AMBIT is this toy that I showed you in my last talk, the Weeble, which is always wobbling, always slightly out of balance, but through mentalizing, correcting, just trying to correct before I go too far in one direction or the other. What we're trying to explain is the dilemma of the worker, not start with the solution. I think until we understand the dilemma, it's difficult to come up with useful solutions. Because do you know what? If there were easy solutions to these problems, we wouldn't all be sitting here. We'd be just doing it out there. So that is 1/4 of the AMBIT wheel, this focus on mentalizing and mentalizing young people thinking about existing helping systems. AMBIT takes a very kind of firm view that that is not enough to make this wheel go round. Most therapies that we train in focus on what happens in that dyadic relationship between me, the therapist, and you, the patient. But that dyad is insufficient in the work that we are doing. We gave a talk recently and the title was No More Heroes Anymore. There's a kind of an assumption that there's some heroic properties that I might be able to get in my mind as a therapist that will make me clever enough of a sort of ninja therapist, that I will find the right moves to kind of cure this young person and this family's minds. And I think that that's a very risky position when we try to work with these very, very troubled and troubling young people and families. Hence, this idea that AMBIT takes a much more global approach to apply mentalizing. So this deployment-focused approach not only kind of looked at what was the experience of workers in the face-to-face work with the young people, where they had this experience that it's difficult to work where help is rejected or is ineffective. Another stress that workers described again and again in many different settings was that, do you know what? This work makes me anxious. And when I'm anxious, I start to feel a little ashamed, as though maybe I'm not the best therapist in the world, because I look at you and you look very relaxed, and you look very relaxed, and you're relaxed, but I'm anxious. So I must be the bad therapist. And this connection between the anxiety of this work and professional shame is, we think, a significant problem. Because shame does one thing very powerfully. It stops me from help seeking. I go and hide in a bush if I'm ashamed. I don't come and ask you and show you what I'm feeling guilty about and ashamed of. And this is absolutely unhelpful in the world that we're working with. So some way to address the notion that this work makes you anxious seemed to us very important. The other problem that teams repeatedly would tell us is that, do you know, in this work, I love working with these clients. I love the families I work with. I'm filled with admiration. They inspire me. You know, the face-to-face work is what I do this for. What drives me crazy in this work is the other professionals. It's the social services department that wanted to remove this child too quickly. It's the school that kept excluding them. It's the doctor who kept playing golf and not actually seeing my patient. It's the police that keep knocking this family's door down rather than trying to understand the context that they are trying to survive in. There's always some reason for us to be very upset or angry or feel let down by other parts of the network of professionals that often become interested in these patients. And more than that, our patients often come to us and say, do you know what? I have to see 5 different professionals from 5 different teams every week. You expect me to trust all of those people? I can't trust one person. And anyway, they all speak different languages, and they all want different things, and they all disagree with each other. Why should I listen to any of them? So the creation of these multi-agency, multi-professional networks is both our greatest triumph in the kind of, if you like, the westernized, wealthy world that we live in. But it's also a total disaster area from the workers' point of view as much as from the young people's, because we find it very difficult to coordinate our work, to integrate what we're doing, and to support each other. We end up falling out, and multi-agency, multi-professional meetings turn into kind of often openly arguments or subtly. But just like the child whose parents have fought in the bedroom and then come out and smile at the child knows they've been fighting. And when I say, "Oh, your social worker said that, did she?" I may not be telling the young person, "I think your social worker's being an idiot," but they know that's what I'm implying. And I try not to do that, but inevitably we get drawn in to these kinds of conflicts and disagreements that are desperately destructive of the young person's belief and trust in help. Just as we tell parents that your arguments may make sense to you, but they're really unhelpful to your child. And we do exactly the same when I argue that my mentalizing approaches are better than your cognitive behavior approaches, and the analyst wants the analytic approach to be, and the systemic therapist, and then the social ecologist gets involved, and then the politician. We all have our models, and they are not necessarily a unified field theory. And the battle between those models is, I think, one of the most pernicious and unhelpful things that as professionals we have allowed to develop. The fourth area was not an area that teams we were working with often put their hand up and said, "Hey, the other thing is that we just keep doing things the way we ordinarily do them because, do you know what, we're too tired, too exhausted, and too anxious to stop and think, why do we do it like this? What if we did it like that?" So we just keep doing it this way because it's how we do it. So it's difficult under conditions of anxiety and stress and limited resources to learn and to change. We know that in our families that we work with and our clients. Why would it be any different for us? We're working under conditions of enormous stress. So there we are as workers, constantly kind of buffeted in these ways, stressed by the fact that our clients don't want to work with us often, they don't trust us as much as we want them to trust us, perhaps isolated and anxious and ashamed to talk to our colleagues about when we're worried, increasingly irritable about other agencies that don't seem to understand, and, if you like, just continuing to do things in the way that we do things because we don't have time to think about doing things anything different. And that's really where AMBIT sort of started from, was trying to apply ideas of mentalizing to these kinds of key problems. Making sense is what mentalizing is, and trying to use this approach in not just the work that we do with the clients, but in these other quadrants. So some of the ideas that made sense to workers that we've talked to are that, when a young person rejects us and pushes us away, it's worth thinking about, why does that make sense? What kind of experiences may this young person have had in the past that means it's sensible to keep the door shut to somebody like me, who comes in and says, "I'm going to make it all fine." Because the last time they let somebody in, they abused them, they humiliated them, they promised them something, and then they broke that promise. So it may make very good sense for them to be very cautious about letting somebody like me into their lives. Equally, another sort of, if you like, reframe, to use a systemic phrase, it makes sense that we should get anxious doing this work. In fact, I would go further. If you don't get anxious doing this work, you should leave this work and go and do something else. Because if you don't get anxious, you're not connected to the reality of the suffering and the pain and the real risks that the young people and the families that you work with are subjected to. It is appropriate to get anxious. But what we don't want is for us to get so anxious that we then lose our minds and lose our capacity to mentalize. So we've got to address, if you like, the reality that this work makes us anxious. We don't need to feel professional shame about feeling anxious. What we do need to do is to have a way of managing our anxiety. And similarly, in terms of these professional networks, if instead of every time another agency does something that I go, instead of that, if I start from the assumption that the natural resting state of complex, multi-agency, multi-professional networks is disintegration. How could it be otherwise? If I start from that assumption, then I don't need to take every misalignment, misunderstanding as some kind of personal assault or some personal failing on the part of another professional. But I see this as an inevitability that we can proactively plan for and have some kind of structured, systematic way of approaching, rather than just becoming angry. And finally, that if I see learning not as some sort of luxury extra, here we are in the most beautiful surroundings. We have the luxury of some days to sit and think. But actually in the work of my team, that is often can feel like a terribly luxurious thing that we would only dream of. But we have to move away from that and say that learning, reflecting, as a team, in real time, is not a luxury. It's absolutely essential. It's at the core of what we would call evidence-based practice. And we often use those words, and we don't translate them into the actions to stop and reflect. We don't just measure our outcomes because that's what our team does. We measure our outcomes, and we make time to look at them and to reflect, maybe with our patients. What do these outcomes mean? What could we do differently that might improve these outcomes? So that is really what AMBIT is an approach to apply mentalizing, not just in the quadrant of the work with our client. There's plenty of mentalization-based, cognitive, systemic, psychoanalytic approaches which can help us and inform us in that. But to, if you like, spread our attention, to balance our attention, that it is equally important that I spend time mentalizing my team and creating a team where there is a more mentalizing ethos. And it's important as a team that we invest time to mentalize the different parts of a network, rather than falling into certainty about why this agency or that worker is doing what they're doing, where we may not actually know. So just very briefly to talk about the kinds of tensions and then to wind up. In terms of the work with our team, the tension there is between the wish to create individual relationships. That's where mentalizing happens. That's where this phrase I talked about in my first talk, epistemic trust, is one. In me making sense of your dilemma in a way that you look at me and you think, now you've understood. And it's nice to be pointed at in that way, not that way. Yeah, that way. Yeah. When we create conditions to form these intense, intimate relationships, we create great risk with these clients. Because a worker who feels it's only me who's made this connection with a young person very quickly can feel overwhelmed, overly responsible, isolated, as though I'm the only person that understands you. And it invites this kind of heroism in the treatment, which we would say is very risky. So what we say is that as much significance in this work, as much significance needs to be placed on the counter, which is the key worker being well connected to their team as they put into connecting and creating a relationship with their patient, their client. As much. So the more I go into relationship with a young person, the more there is a kind of entropy that I am exposed to, a kind of chaos that I can fall into. And it's my relationship with members of the team that holds me and enables me to go into this relationship knowing that somebody is holding my rope, somebody is connected, has me in mind and my mind in mind. So the analogy we use often is the mountaineer. It's not just how clever I am at climbing, it's who's holding my rope. And are they communicating with me, and can I communicate with them appropriately? And I think many teams doing this work, we assume that we do that. And we don't necessarily do it explicitly. It's done implicitly. And AMBIT is all for doing these things explicitly. So we have various approaches, and I don't have time to talk about them, but particularly this idea of the team around the worker as a complementary way of thinking around the team that gathers around a child. It's the same network, but we can gather around the worker. On the other side, we want to work in multiple domains, all the areas of this young person's life, and the counter to that is that we need to address the disintegration. I often say rocket scientists are described as if they do the most complicated work in the world. It's not true. The work that we do, multi-agency, multi-professional work with very complex clients, is much more complicated than rocket science. It's much, much more difficult. And we've developed some mentalizing tools, one of which we played with just earlier, called the disintegration grid, which just help workers systematically to mentalize the different parts of a network and to create a system that is more mindful of the minds of which it is composed. Let me say that once more, because these systems are mindless. They're just systems, but they are comprised of minds, people with minds. We need to create systems where there is a culture of purposefully trying to make sense of why this social worker, it makes sense to him or her to do this, and this police officer to do that. And it doesn't take a lot more time. It just is a different way of working. It requires a little bit more humility. I don't have a lot of time to say on the learning bit, but the tension there is between evidence-based practice, we should be respectful of evidence, and practice-based evidence, local expertise and experience. You can have evidence-based practice, but if it's applied at the wrong time, in the wrong way with the family will reject it. And often the person who knows the timing and the how will be the worker, or at the very least that team that has experience of working in that culture, in that setting. So we want a balance between respect for evidence and respect for local expertise. And that approach has informed the way that AMBIT has been built, where we build AMBIT online in these open wikis, a website that kind of adapts with time with people who use them. So I don't have time to go any further in my exploration of AMBIT with you now, but I encourage you to have a look at our online websites. Everything we've done is open source. We're into kind of feedback and positive loops. So please have a look at our website. There's various papers which I will show you the links to, but I'm happy to take any questions for a couple of minutes if there's time.